In December 2018, Minneapolis did something no major American city had ever done. It eliminated single-family zoning. Overnight, triplexes became legal on every residential lot in the city. Urbanists celebrated. Homeowners panicked. The national media declared it a revolution. 6 years later, fewer than 30 triplexes have been built. But here's the paradox. While the triplex revolution never materialized, Minneapolis rents grew just 1%, while the rest of Minnesota saw 14% increases. The reform everyone debated failed. The reform nobody noticed worked. This is the real estate historian, where housing, power, and policy collide. And nothing is ever as simple as the headlines suggest. To understand why Minneapolis made this choice, we need to go back more than a century. Not to a planning meeting, but to a deed. In 1910, the first racially restrictive covenants appeared in Minneapolis property titles. These legal instruments, inserted by developers and neighborhood associations, explicitly barred the sale or occupancy of homes to African Americans. They were effective, but geographically piecemeal. They required individual action. Then, in 1917, the Supreme Court struck down explicit racial zoning in Buchanan versus Worley. Cities could no longer designate specific blocks for black or white residents by law. So they pivoted. They found a race-neutral mechanism that achieved the same result. In 1924, Minneapolis adopted its first comprehensive zoning ordinance. While framed as protecting health, safety, and neighborhood character, the ordinance designated vast swaths of the city, exclusively for single-family homes on large lots. The economic barrier was the point. Those who couldn't afford detached homes on generous plots were effectively excluded. And in 1920s America, that meant disproportionately excluding black families. These zoning lines didn't evolve in a vacuum. They became the template for the federal redlining maps of the 1930s. Areas zoned single-family were graded A for investment. Mixed-use or multifamily zones were starved of capital. By 2018, 70% of Minneapolis residential land remained locked in single-family zoning. In New York, that figure was 15%. In Seattle, closer to 40%. Minneapolis had preserved its exclusionary architecture more completely than almost any peer city. And researchers at the University of Minnesota's Mapping Prejudice project had traced the modern racial wealth gap directly back to these century-old lines. The zoning map wasn't neutral. It was a segregationist artifact, still shaping who lived where. On December 7, 2018, the Minneapolis City Council voted 12-1 to approve the Minneapolis 2040 Comprehensive Plan. The plan allowed duplexes and triplexes on every residential lot in the city. The political coalition behind it was unusual. Environmental activists argued density reduces carbon emissions. Racial justice advocates pointed to the mapping prejudice data. Labor unions wanted construction jobs. Young renters, locked out of high-opportunity neighborhoods by price, demanded access. Council President Lisa Bender, a trained urban planner, framed the vote as a moral imperative. Quote, "This is about undoing government-sanctioned racism." The opposition organized quickly. Groups like Smart Growth Minneapolis argued the plan would destroy neighborhood character, increase traffic, and harm the environment. The demographic composition of the opposition was telling. Primarily older, wealthier white homeowners from the city's most exclusive districts. They would eventually sue. Using the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act, they argued the density itself was an environmental harm. Birds would die. Stormwater would flood. The lawsuit froze implementation for years. But here's what got lost in the headlines about triplexes. Minneapolis 2040 did something else. It upzoned transit corridors for large apartment buildings, and it eliminated parking minimums citywide. These reforms received a fraction of the attention. They would turn out to be the ones that mattered. The triplex revolution never came. and the math explains why. Let's walk through what it actually costs to build a triplex in Minneapolis. Land acquisition. Purchasing a tear-down single-family home in a desirable neighborhood costs $300,000 to $400,000. Demolition, $30,000. Construction. Building a 2,500 square foot triplex at modest quality runs about $625,000. Soft costs, architecture, permitting, utility hookups, another $100,000. Total project cost, approximately $1.1 million. Now, let's look at the return. 3 800 square foot units renting at $1,600 per month generates $57,600 in annual gross income. Operating expenses, taxes, insurance, maintenance, are roughly $20,000. Net operating income, about $37,600. Debt service, on an $800,000 commercial loan at 7% interest, $64,000 annually. The result, negative cash flow. The project loses money every month, and here's the killer. The zoning code limited the building envelope. A maximum floor area ratio of 0.5 meant that on a standard 5,000 square foot Minneapolis lot, you could only build 2,500 square feet of space. Divided by 3, that's 833 square feet per unit. Once you subtract hallways and stairwells, each apartment shrinks to a cramped one-bedroom or studio. Height limits of 2.5 stories prevented efficient 3-story stacked flats. Building codes triggered commercial sprinkler requirements for 3-unit buildings, adding $30,000 to $40,000 in costs. The punchline? It's almost always more profitable to renovate the existing single-family home and sell it for $700,000, or tear it down and build a larger, luxury single-family house. The zoning said triplexes were legal. The economics said they were irrational. Between 2020 and 2024, Minneapolis permitted 87 buildings containing duplexes, triplexes, or fourplexes. Total units from these small buildings, 225. That's less than 1.5% of all new housing permitted. In 2024, the city issued 0 permits for new triplexes. So if triplexes failed, why did Minneapolis rents stay flat? The answer was hiding in the fine print. While the nation argued about single-family zoning, Minneapolis was building apartments, lots of them. In 2019 alone, the city permitted 4,646 multifamily units, not triplexes, 5-story apartment buildings, 8-story mixed-use towers, kind of development that can absorb $50 million in financing and generate economies of scale. The elimination of parking minimums made this possible. When cities require 1 or 2 parking spaces per apartment, developers must build structured garages costing $30,000 to $50,000 per stall. That cost gets passed to renters. Minneapolis removed that requirement entirely. Developers could now build on smaller urban lots that couldn't previously support the required parking ratios. The upzoning of transit corridors allowed apartment buildings where previously only single-family homes were permitted. Not triplexes tucked into neighborhoods, but genuine density along bus lines and light rail stations. The numbers tell the story. From 2017 to 2022, Minneapolis rents grew just 1%, the rest of Minnesota, 14%. Peer cities nationally, over 20%. In January 2019, Minneapolis had the 29th highest rent among 126 cities tracked. By December 2023, it had dropped to 74th. The famous reform failed. The boring reforms worked. The triplex legalization was a political lightning rod that absorbed all the controversy. Parking elimination and corridor upzoning did the actual work of adding housing supply. When Minneapolis said it was ending single-family zoning for racial equity, that framing contained an assumption that small-scale neighborhood triplexes would enable wealth building for middle-class and BIPOC families. That didn't happen. The winners and losers sorted differently. Who benefited? Renters. The apartment boom stabilized rents during a period when the rest of America saw double-digit increases. Lower-income tenants weren't displaced by a wave of construction that never came. Corporate developers, the firms that could finance 50 to 200 unit buildings on transit corridors, captured the upzoning. They had the capital, the expertise, and the tolerance for commercial permitting that small players lacked. Existing homeowners. Despite fears, single-family property values remained robust. Neighborhood character was largely preserved because the triplexes were never built. Homeowners kept their equity and their low-density surroundings. Who was left behind? Aspiring, small-scale landlords. The promise of wealth building through triplex ownership for middle-class families failed. The financing and regulatory barriers were too high. Minneapolis legalized the idea of a triplex without providing the capital or code relief to build one. Families needing 3-bedroom units. The new apartments are predominantly studios and 1-bedrooms. The lack of triplex construction meant no significant increase in family-sized housing. Many left for the suburbs. And perhaps most revealingly, the lawsuit that delayed implementation for years was funded by progressive environmentalists from wealthy neighborhoods using green language to maintain exclusion. The coalition that opposed density in 2018 looked remarkably like the coalition that drew the redlining maps in 1934. Minneapolis proved something that housing reformers are only beginning to understand. Legalization is not the same as construction. Making something legal doesn't make it profitable, and making it profitable requires more than removing a line from a zoning code. The triplex revolution that urbanists dreamed of and homeowners feared was never economically viable without density bonuses, fee waivers, or code relief that Minneapolis didn't provide. Meanwhile, the parking reform and corridor upzoning that generated almost no controversy produced almost all the results. The system worked exactly as designed. Large developers who can navigate commercial financing and permitting captured the benefits. Small-scale builders who were supposed to diversify neighborhood wealth faced barriers too steep to climb. Existing homeowners lost nothing. Renters gained stability. The missing middle remained missing. And that's the deeper lesson of Minneapolis. When cities reform zoning, they're not just changing laws. They're changing the economics of who can build, who can profit, and who gets left out. The reform everyone debated was symbolic. The reform that mattered was technical. And no one was paying attention to the right one. If this gave you a new perspective on how housing policy actually works, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.